Tom, first of all, just explain to us what Biobank is.
Okay, so the UK Biobank was set up in 2003, I believe, if memory serves, to recruit participants in the UK to build what has now become the most valuable medical research, human medical research database that we've got, really. Volunteers submit to having their DNA sequenced, to doing a number of tests and investigations with researchers from Biobank. These include biological samples like blood and saliva. Most recently, we reported on how they've completed a huge campaign to do medical imaging of 100,000 of those participants, brain scans, full body scans. It's a hugely valuable resource for medical researchers. About 21,000 researchers and possibly more around the world have used this data. It's led to tens of thousands of publications and new discoveries in fields from cancer to heart disease to stroke and things like Alzheimer's. It's a hugely valuable thing, and it's valuable to researchers because they can access this data by signing an agreement, a contract with Biobank to get access to the data of the participants who volunteered their information to it. And what appears to have happened in this case is academics at 3 Chinese academic institutions, they've not been named at this stage, got access to that data legitimately through the arrangement they had with Biobank, but then, for reasons that we're not too sure about, then chose to make that data available commercially on platforms in China. As you were saying there, we've been reassured by Biobank that, as far as they understand it, that data was never sold. It's now been taken down. As well as blocking access to those researchers and those academic institutions, they've also shut down the entire access to the entire database for any researchers worldwide, while they take various steps to prevent this from happening again.
So why is this a breach, in inverted commas, and not a hack?
Well, because the data that was obtained off UK Biobank, off their secure server, which is hosted here in the UK, was done legitimately. It was done by researchers who'd signed a contract with them, agreeing to the terms of that agreement, which is you don't make this data publicly available. You can use it for your research, you can access it on our secure server, but you don't copy it and paste it somewhere else, and that appears to be what has happened here. There have been previous incidents. About a month ago it emerged that some of this data, quite a lot of this data actually, was available on various online repository called GitHub, which researchers routinely use to store large amounts of data associated with publications. They've been put on there without people realising it should have been on the website. That was discovered and it was removed. So in a way, it's one of the pitfalls or the downfalls of having open access for researchers, albeit ones who sign strict confidentiality agreements and contracts. But by putting that data out there, it is hard to then contain it once you've allowed researchers to have access to it. It relies a lot on trust and a lot on people, the research community, committing to those arrangements they have with Biobank. And in this case, it seems that trust and those contracts were clearly breached.
What would a buyer be able to do with this data, Tom?
I think that's
given that it hasn't got names, phone numbers, addresses, you know. I
think that's the really important question here. I can understand how this is worrying for the 500,000 participants of Biobank. Not all of them are still alive. They tend to be recruited later in life. I can't remember quite the entry requirements, but I think it's people in their 50s and older. So given it's been going for 20 years, some of those people have gone. My mother, for example, is a participant of Biobank and has given over her data. I can see why it'd be concerning for them, because it includes I've got a little bit more information here about the type of information that was available. It's gender, age, month and year of birth. It's not your specific date of birth. That makes it quite hard to individually identify someone. So it's just the month and year of birth. But in that, it's got information on socioeconomic status, lifestyle habits, mental health. This was stuff that would have been reported to Biobank when people signed up. Cognitive function measurements, physical measures, and measures from those biological samples, not any data on the samples themselves. And again, the genomic data, the entire genome of people, which Biobank also store, is not available in this data set, but scores from that data will be, and scores from the biological samples as well. So it's, in the absence of that ability to identify an individual, it's not hugely compromising to any one person, but it is of enormous value. I mean, if you're a researcher, or you're a medical insurance company, for example, someone who wants to get a good snapshot of a large chunk of the UK population, sort of medical and health information, it's very valuable. And that's why it is shared with researchers under quite strict confidentiality agreements. And here's a really good example of how that system has failed. And I think it's going to put a lot of pressure on Biobank to ensure that they, find out much more secure ways of sharing this data, keeping that openness available for medical researchers worldwide. It was a charity set up with that openness as central to its function, but without having compromises like this. But I think it's understandable that people will be very concerned. This is quite personal information, but I also think looking at it would be almost impossible to identify an individual just from the data that is out there.
Interesting you talk about medical insurance companies finding this data useful. I suppose also, given that there have been concerns about Chinese spying in the UK and how that system operates, just fundamentally one country finding out interesting medical details about a large swathe of the population of another country could be useful for other reasons, couldn't it?
You could certainly speculate on that, although to be fair, there's quite a lot of information now online through all sorts of different medical publications and things like that, where you could probably get a better overview of that from other sources. I mean, there is, I suppose you could invoke the idea, and this was proven by some journalists who got access to some biobank data previously. If you know someone is a participant, you know their month and year of birth, and you know something about their medical history. You had a hip hop in December of 2019, and you have high blood pressure. You could use those. You could use those bits of information to then jigsaw identify somebody from this data and learn quite a bit more about them. So you could imagine, if you were a Chinese spy agency, you knew exactly who you were looking for, you could figure things out. But I think for members of the general public who volunteered their information, that information alone isn't of much value or use, or probably of much interest to anyone. The value of this biobank data really is the granular amount of information it provides for researchers looking at a particular disease or a particular research objective, like the science of aging or Alzheimer's disease and things like that. I think you have to have a pretty specific espionage target. And I'd also imagine, given how those agencies work, this is sort of data they might not be able to get their hands on before by various nefarious means, although they would be, obviously, any academics who released it would have been in breach of those contracts and these sharing agreements. So I think it's certainly something Biobank are going to have to get on top of and make it much less possible. One of the things they're looking at is, for example, restricting the ability of scientists to download large amounts of data off the server to use on their own computers. They'll have to use it on those secure sites, and it has to stay there. And I think that there were plans to overhaul that this year anyway. But that's the work that's going to have to go on to rebuild confidence and trust amongst the participants that take part.